Hello, this is William Head with Team DUI. We're discussing drunk driving, drugged driving, all the issues that relate to how many different ways you might be arrested for DUI in the United States. We're moving on from part one where we talked about impaired driving by alcohol or drugs, part two that we talked about being above the legal limit for alcohol. Now we're going to talk about DUI-drugs, being over the legal limit for drugs in some jurisdictions that have now changed their law to actually have a numeric reading that makes you under the influence in terms of the law for purposes of a conviction with small microscopic traces of certain drugs in your system. By virtue of new laws relating to medical marijuana in Colorado, Washington D.C. has just liberalized its law, and other states are passing laws, including Georgia in 2015. So the change in the laws and making marijuana legal for some people for certain circumstances also means there's going to have to be a corresponding change in the DWI or DUI laws relating to DUI drugs. Numerous states have had to craft statutes to identify when a driver will be in violation of state law merely by driving while having a minuscule, non-psychoactive trace of the contraband substance, that is marijuana, in his or her system, and that is the bloodstream, the urine, any place that it can be detected. It can even be detected in saliva. There is a breath test now that is supposed to be able to identify marijuana, but it's not been approved in any states that I'm familiar with. So these states are having to wrestle with the laws and find what's going to be a fair per se DUI-DWI-drugs driving law, which is a different problem than simply legalizing medical marijuana. The first thing you have to understand is that marijuana is not being legalized in these locations except under a prescription, or in other states like Georgia simply for a doctor to give marijuana for purposes of certain illnesses for treatment purposes. The marijuana drug itself, unlike alcohol, has had a very banned place in American history. Alcohol is also a drug, and that particular drug has caused 10 times, 100 times more harm than anything to do with marijuana. But alcohol has been in use around the world for more than 10,000 years, and when it came to America, it was very much an accepted thing around the world. So marijuana has been given a special place, and that is it's been a crime for which people have spent many years in prison, whereas for alcohol, it's a drug that's sold in stores all over America. I want to give you a little brief scenario to show you the difference between the fairness or the lack thereof of our laws. If you had a person who was an alcohol drinker, who had his last drink at midnight before retiring for the night, and the next day on the way to work about 7:30 gets in a minor fender bender, and when the police come up, they say we can smell alcohol. They go ahead and test him, and he's a 0.02% alcohol level. That's under the legal limit, and that's also presumptively allows you to drive if you're 21 and over. Yet with marijuana, most states proscribe extremely low traces of burn-off byproducts of cannabis when no scientific evidence at all exists to show impairment in any degree. And yet this criminal conduct will support a DUI conviction and cost you the right to drive, your complete right to drive in many states, including Georgia. First offense DUI drugs is 6 months, total loss of license. Second offense, 1 full year, no type of work permit. In the states that have put in a numeric reading of how many nanograms you can have of the THC metabolite and be then guilty of DUI, is going to be something that's litigated in Colorado, Washington State, and several other places in the next few years. That's why you need a DUI lawyer who understands this law at a different level, not just a cursory level. They have to really know what they're doing. A per se DUI law involving DUI drugs merely requires that the prosecution be able to introduce the forensic test result and then try to convince the judge or jury, depending on what your state permits for a trial, that the numeric reading they obtained is reliable and trustworthy. And remember that if you admit anything to the police officer, that is, that you've used the drug versus that you might have been exposed to marijuana in a passive inhalation manner, you may, by your own words, have made your case much worse if you're stopped by police. So if you've watched my other videos, you know that other than name and address, that's the only things you tell a police officer. That's all you're required to tell them according to the U.S. Supreme Court. That's what I suggest. As to opposed to DUI alcohol, which are usually breath tests on a breathalyzer of some type, when it comes to drugs, you're usually going to see that these tests are run on DUI drugs cases through the state crime lab, a private laboratory who's contracted to perform state forensic tests, or you might possibly find a hospital toxicology department giving the readings, especially if you've been in an accident. They'll pull your blood and run those in the laboratory at the hospital. That evidence can be collected by the police through a warrant or search warrant of some type, so be aware that you may be facing those test results at trial.